Oh man, I wonder which Game Boy is the best. This piece of human dog shit, or literally anything else. You know what I want to do today? I just want to go through all of the Game Boy releases, the entire Game Boy line, and just talk about each of them. You know, nothing crazy. You know, let's kick back today. Let's talk about how this is just... Why would you want this? The original Game Boy from 1989. Yeah, this is one of the most iconic handheld devices of all time. I genuinely have no idea how you can actually use this these days. Or even back then, because this has one of the worst damn screens of all time. But I mean, this handheld contains such a vital life lesson. You know, in comparison to the other handhelds at the time, you know, the Sega Game Gear or Atari Lynx, you know, handhelds that had full color displays, lit screens. At the end of the day, it didn't matter because the Game Boy, using lesser expensive technology, allowed it to be far cheaper, have far better battery life, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because name a single Atari Lynx game you give a damn about. Hell, name a single damn Atari Lynx game. The Game Boy truly gave us an NES to go, with some compromises. Of course, it is fully black and white, but you get a full suite of controls here that you'd get on the NES, and you'd get many games that were handheld versions of NES games. So we have Super Mario Land 2 here, we have Mega Man Dr. Wily's Revenge. I would say these are pretty fair representations of their series on the go. I mean, Mario Land 2 is pretty damn good. Mega Man Dr. Wily's Revenge, you can make do with. But something like Mario Land 2 is a little rough on an original Game Boy model like this, considering this is a bit of a later release in the system's life, you know, a couple of years in. They started to get a little ballsier with everything on screen. You know, this game has far more detailed visuals than, say, the first Mario Land game. That game was simple, but not to a fault. Like, you could actually view it on, I don't even think I can consider this a display. So let's take a look at this. You know, we plug Mario Land 2 in, and then we turn it on. Of course, I grew up more with Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance games, so when I think of a Game Boy startup screen, I think of the Game Boy logo and the little ding sound. On the original Game Boy, though, the Nintendo logo comes down, and if there's a cartridge read error, you get this jarbled nonsense here. I think I've seen some, like, t-shirt designs that have, like, the various glitched out Nintendo logos, which, you know, I kind of like that. Oh, and it works. And there we go, Mario Land 2. I can barely see this screen. I mean, I already can tell you can barely see this screen. I'm viewing this from an angle. Like, this is how I'm seeing it right now. Thankfully, in the original Game Boy, we do have a contrast dial, which can help. Not really, to be honest. I'm not getting a great view regardless. To have any chance of viewing it, I need to hold it more so directly straight onto my face. And when I do that, yeah, it's fine. For 1989, the speaker quality ain't too bad. It's the screen that's the problem, and it's not just the fact that it's green, it's not just the fact that it's black and white, it's not just the fact that there's no light here, it's the fact that it doesn't move very well. It's so hard to tell what's going on when you're moving your character. It's pretty bad. It's definitely not unplayable, but when there's far better options to experience Game Boy games these days, what are you doing with this thing, man? But I will say, I don't remember the last time I actually changed the batteries on this thing. That's dangerous because I have left batteries in here and they could corrode at any moment. But still, the original Game Boy is an icon. An icon I do not want to touch with a 10-foot pole. And to be honest, that's why I like talking about this kind of junk on video. It gives me an excuse to play this stuff again, because if I was doing this based on what I want to do with my own free time, I'd probably still do it, but I'd have less of a reason to. But still, compared to the original Game Boy, I would much prefer playing with a Game Boy Pocket. Now, when it comes to the overall feel, I think I actually kind of prefer the original here. I think the D-pad and buttons just feel very premium. They feel incredibly substantial. They don't feel bad over here, but with the smaller form factor, you know, that's a plus, but you know, I'm already not taking this on the go. So these days, like, the smaller form factor isn't really that much of a plus. You do have a lot to grip onto with the original Game Boy. But this was an upgrade in every way. Instead of 4 AA batteries, it uses 2 AAA batteries. It's significantly smaller, meaning you can genuinely quite possibly fit this in your pocket. If you've ever tried to fit an original Game Boy in your pocket, I think you walk funny now. But I think the biggest upgrade with the original Game Boy Pocket is the screen. It's not backlit, it's still black and white, but it is just leagues better. I feel like it's just way easier to see. It's still not perfect, and you also still have a bit of blurry movement when action on screen is taking place, but I just find this screen to be so much clearer. The contrast dial actually feels like it's doing something, and when you're viewing it straight on, it does look quite okay. I think this is a pretty solid upgrade. Definitely a very necessary one. The original Game Boy is like one of the most like, holy shit, you got away with that things I've ever seen. And the Game Boy Pocket really helped the Game Boy to have as long of a lifespan as it did. I mean, like, this came out around like 1996. This released in 1989, so the first revision of the Game Boy released 7 years later. My lord, and just like a little bit after that, Pokemon finally released. The Game Boy had an incredibly strange, long lifespan, especially for a few years there. They weren't doing anything. This was all you had. But then randomly, by the late 90s, they started actually releasing new Game Boy models, such as the Game Boy Light. This is definitely interesting considering the lineage of Nintendo handhelds. We got a Nintendo DS Lite, spelled L-I-T-E, and a Nintendo Switch Lite. And of course, we have a Game Boy Light as well, but light for those handhelds more so means like, oh yeah, this is smaller, more compact, a better design. Game Boy Light genuinely means there's a light now. This is incredibly similar to the Game Boy Pocket in terms of design, though it is a bit bigger, obviously because we got, you know, a light now. We're playing the exact same OG Game Boy games, now with a screen that is pretty much the same as the Game Boy Pocket, but if you put it all the way to the right, the backlight turns on. And overall, it's a bit bigger. We do have this ridge on the back with the battery cover, and the overall larger size makes this still more than pocketable, but I think like a pretty comfortable handheld to hold. Again, not like the Game Boy Pocket isn't comfortable, but you know, if I had to choose, I think the Game Boy Light feels pretty damn nice. Now this only released in Japan in 1998. Now, why is that? Because, you know, like what, us Americans don't like seeing things? Well, no, because within that same year, Nintendo was releasing the Game Boy Color, more of an actual successor to the Game Boy. Having the Game Boy Light and having the Game Boy Color just didn't really seem that necessary. I think it just kind of overcomplicated things. Like, oh, here's the new Game Boy Color, where you can play all your Game Boy games, and it has a whole new slew of games, all in color. And here's the Game Boy Light, which is literally just a Game Boy, but the screen has a light on it now. It just probably didn't seem worth it. It probably would just muddy their messaging there. But it is kind of lame considering, like, this is probably the definitive original Game Boy model, pre-Game Boy Color. Of course, that's not saying much, you know, oh, the original Game Boy is the definitive Game Boy model, pre-Game Boy Pocket. It was also the only original Game Boy model, so, you know, that's what I'm saying here. Like, okay, great. I'd say these days, this is like a really cool novelty. You know, it's the Game Boy we never got in North America. That's what's really interesting about it. That's kind of it. The backlight isn't very good. It's kind of this weird color, and it barely makes any difference outside of any situation other than pure darkness. Like with other backlights on other handhelds, whether it's like the Game Gear or even the Game Boy Advance SP, you know, just having the light in general, it doesn't matter if I'm in the dark or I'm not, you know, it does help things. This light doesn't help things. When I'm not in darkness, like, I don't notice the lights on at all. But hey, it sure as hell beat the accessories they released for the Game Boy, where you'd have to clip on this lamp, shine on the screen, and it didn't even work that well. Like, look at this. What kind of a light is this? Like, yes, it does work. This would come in handy during a long road trip in the middle of the night, but that's all this is for. The Game Boy Light is such a cool little obscure novelty that we never got over here. Like I said, it's definitely the definitive pre-Game Boy Color Game Boy. That doesn't say much, so let's just talk about the Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Color. Now this is an iconic design. As much as the original Game Boy is an iconic design, this just screams 90s to me. If there's any product that feels like it just encompasses the 90s, or the late 90s at the very least, and early 2000s, it's the Game Boy Color. I mean, not only do we have the funky colors of the handheld, but we also have translucent variants as well. Now, over the years, I have considered myself a bit of one with a stick up its ass about considering the Game Boy Color to be the successor to the original Game Boy. You know, that is kind of right, but for the most part, Nintendo almost always lumps the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color together when talking about these systems. I mean, just look at Nintendo Switch Online. Both Game Boy and Game Boy Color games are under the same Game Boy Nintendo Switch Online app, while Game Boy Advance is considered its own thing. When Nintendo considers the sales numbers for Game Boy, they lump both of these in, which I understand, but it just gets a little strange considering how many truly exclusive Game Boy Color games are out there. So Game Boy Color plays all original Game Boy cartridges. In fact, it actually gives them a bit of color, which is pretty impressive. You know, it doesn't put them in full color, but it does a really good job kind of assigning certain color palettes to games. And the screen here is just so much better than any Game Boy prior. Of course, it's still kind of hard to see because it's not backlit. So the added color to these original Game Boy games, it's frankly barely noticeable. Like, as you can see here in Mega Man, the general gameplay is still basically black and white with a little bit of like some light color thrown in there. Like, the Mega Man icon is blue, so like that's something. The screen is definitely better here. That doesn't mean it's good. I think the biggest upgrade here for the original Game Boy games isn't the color. It's actually the fact that the screen is clear enough where when action is going on screen, it doesn't start blurring the fuck out. Another major addition to the Game Boy Color is this, a little IR blaster, kind of like a TV remote control. Not a lot of games use this. Some games did, but it's kind of a very minor addition that isn't really that necessary or was really used at all. You could communicate with other Game Boy Colors this way by pointing like that. I believe there were some things where, like, if you pointed a TV remote control to it, then, you know, some games would have something happen. That's all I got for you. But the Game Boy Color didn't just play original Game Boy games. You have these cartridges here, which are combo cartridges. These work on both the original Game Boy models and the Game Boy Color. They are mostly all black cartridges, but then we have the Game Boy Color exclusives. And these cartridges bring me back. So these are roughly the same size, but they are translucent, and the Game Boy Color header here is, you know, bumping out. The Game Boy Color was definitely more powerful than the original Game Boy, but it wasn't enough to consider it like a full-on successor. It was powerful enough to put a full-blown port of Donkey Kong Country on the thing. That's kind of gross. You know what I always liked trying out as a kid? When I saw some kids at school had original Game Boys, I tried to do some little mixing and matching. I tried to play like Chef in the Kitchen, and I was just like, oh, well, what happens when you put a Game Boy Color cartridge in an original Game Boy? They all have little error screens. It's so cool. You know, throughout the entire Game Boy's life, it was like we were getting sequels or Game Boy reimaginings of the console games, and finally on Game Boy Color, it's like we could actually get the full-blown console games. You know, we got Donkey Kong Country. You know, it was Donkey Kong Country. You know, not good Donkey Kong Country, but, you know, it was the game, sure. But we also got, like, Super Mario Brothers Deluxe. I mean, that was just flat out the original Super Mario Brothers with added features. That was incredible. But on the original Game Boy, we got stuff like Donkey Kong Land, which is like a black and white Game Boy-ified version of Donkey Kong Country. So instead of something like this, we get flat out Donkey Kong Country. You know, I feel like it's kind of up for debate, like which one is actually better. You know, this one doesn't age particularly well when you play it in black and white, and just it's way too busy. The graphics are way too busy. They're way too detailed to really like work that well. But I think it controls okay. Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color feels a little crunchy, both in terms of visually and how it plays. But damn it, we were one console away from just getting the full-blown console games on the go. It's pretty silly how all the Game Boys tried to make Donkey Kong Country work on it. The Game Boy Advance, it works pretty well. Yeah, my bad, I don't have much to say about the Game Boy Color, but yeah, when it comes down to it, this is like one of the most iconic, popular Game Boys. At the same time, it didn't leave a huge impact because only a few years later, we got the Game Boy Advance with a completely new form factor. I mean, this is just completely horizontal with a big widescreen display. We actually have shoulder buttons added, adding a fair amount of functionality to the mix, but still no backlight. That's a big problem with this thing, but it's pretty crazy. I mean, the cartridges are exactly like the original Game Boy cartridges, just cut in half. And these games are so much bigger. The Game Boy Advance is often seen as a Super Nintendo to go. I mean, literally, we have a Super Nintendo game here on Game Boy Advance, and it's pretty fully featured. Yes, there's gonna be compromises. Most of the Super Nintendo games they re-released on GBA do have elements that they kind of had to tweak, like maybe the music isn't as good, or the screen is more zoomed in, so it's harder to see where you're going. And for the amount of Super Nintendo games they put on the Game Boy Advance, it's crazy to me that they just didn't include more face buttons. They stopped at the shoulder buttons, and they were like, we're good. You'd think we'd get like X and Y buttons by now, especially after like we've had these same button layout for decades. And then we finally get new buttons and you just want to stop at L and R. To be honest though, I've always been underwhelmed by the original Game Boy Advance, primarily because, you know, it's hard to see the damn screen. We're still this far into the Game Boy lineage and we don't have a backlight. However, this model feels really damn good in the hands, man. I mean, the horizontal landscape, just, it works so much better. Your hands are a nice distance apart. It just feels really good. And that's why I see so many mods for the original GBA that adds a much better screen here. Because without that, we had to wait a couple years for what might possibly be the greatest handheld redesign of all time. And of course, what I just said was the original Game Boy Advance was far more comfortable. Yeah, I've always told myself the GBA SP is one of Nintendo's greatest handhelds. Playing it these days, though, it feels fine. But yeah, the original model is definitely superior when it comes to the feel of it all. However, as a kid, playing this, it was a game changer. Bam, look at this, it's a light. You probably can't notice because we're heavily well lit in this area, but yes, the Game Boy Advance SP has a light on the screen. It's about goddamn time. We also have the clamshell design making this ultra portable. I mean, look at this thing. It literally fits in my fist. We also introduced a rechargeable battery, which is massive. You know, the amount of things they added to the Game Boy Advance SP is mind-boggling. You know, like this introduced so many staples of Nintendo handhelds from this point forward. I always loved the clamshell design as a kid because it made me feel like, you know, I have my own little personal laptop. And on top of that, the light was a game changer. It's not the greatest light. Like I said, you can barely notice it. However, Nintendo fixed that. Here we have the Game Boy Advance SP everybody wants. It's the slight revision. If you go on the back here, this one says AGS 001. This right here is AGS 101. The 101 has the better screen. I mean, look, I turn this on and the light is on and I can turn it off here. What am I doing? You can barely tell a difference. The 101, like, oh my God. You know what's crazy? This isn't even the highest setting. You gotta turn it on even more. It's like, oh my Jesus. Now that's a damn screen. The 101 is the definitive Game Boy. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you can play your Game Boy Advance games, and in addition, you can play Game Boy Color and original Game Boy games. They do stick out a bit. It's not my favorite thing in the world, but what are you gonna do? I mean, like, oh, it sticks out a bit, but I can literally play every single Game Boy game known to man. This is amazing. And I know I definitely just shit on the Game Boy Advance SP, how it feels. It doesn't feel bad at all. My problem is the fact that the original Game Boy Advance just feels that much better. The fact that they go back to more of a vertical design kind of means there's more of a chance for your fingers to kind of get jumbled up behind here. You know, it's kind of harder to have something to grip onto. In comparison to the original Game Boy Advance, I mean, this thing is nothing but curve city. The one flaw with the Game Boy Advance SP, no headphone jack. I have no idea why they couldn't put a headphone jack on here. To be honest, as a kid, I don't really recall, like, noticing much. I think it definitely stung when I had my Game Boy Advance video cartridges and I would watch those, but You know, like I would do that on a Game Boy Advance SP. That's something I actually didn't remember until now. I definitely played my Game Boy Advance video cartridges on my Game Boy Advance SP, like in public. Like I remember taking this into like a restaurant and playing a Game Boy Advance video while I waited for the food to come as like an 8-year-old. And without a headphone jack, I'm kind of thinking like, wow, I was a dick. You had to get an adapter to use the headphone jack. Much like modern smartphones, Nintendo was ahead of the curve here. I always found that it would have made more sense if like it came with a headphone jack and then, you know, you had to get an adapter to use the link cable. I understand Pokemon is like the biggest thing ever for Game Boys, so, you know, they probably wanted to put the link cable in there first and foremost, so then you could immediately trade your Pokemon. Now, hey, either way, you're gonna have headphones laying around, you may not have a link cable laying around, so I feel like it would have made more sense to give everybody a headphone jack rather than everybody a link cable port. I don't know. Even without the headphone jack, this is the definitive Game Boy. The definitive Game Boy. So this is the Game Boy's legacy, huh? The Game Boy Micro. The final Game Boy released. This released after the Game Boy's successor, the Nintendo DS. That happened in 2004, and it kind of came out of nowhere. You know, the Game Boy Advance was doing quite well. The GBASP just released in 2003, and only a year later, Nintendo announced a new handheld that's like a completely new console. The Game Boy Advance debuted in 2001. This had such a short shelf span from when it released to when the successor came out. But to be fair, Nintendo didn't originally position the DS as a Game Boy successor. Keep in mind, up to this point, Nintendo pretty much only did Game Boy handhelds. All of their handhelds were Game Boys. So it was probably scary for them to kind of do a different type of portable device that isn't a Game Boy. So they positioned it as the third pillar. You had the GameCube, the Game Boy Advance, and the Nintendo DS. In the end, I call BS to that whole thing. The DS was always gonna be the successor to the GBA. I mean, they included a Game Boy Advance slot in the DS. It's like, you wouldn't do that unless that was meant to be like the true successor. They called it backwards compatibility. How is this not the successor, yet it's backwards compatible with the Game Boy Advance? It was always meant to be the successor. They put the Game Boy Advance slot in there because they were terrified that the DS was not gonna work, but they wanted it to work, and it sure did. But Nintendo kept releasing Game Boy Advance games afterwards. I remember The Legend of Zelda The Minish Cap was released after the DS already released. So like you're getting like a full-blown Zelda game on the Game Boy Advance. Like things were still cooking. And in 2005, they introduced the Game Boy Micro, kind of to give the Game Boy a bit of a different funk. You know, especially now that you have the DS out, you know, okay, so what's the Game Boy? Well, how about ultra portable fun? They were definitely trying to push this kind of like an iPod Nano, I guess. You know, just kind of like this stylish little device to get some fun in on your runs. It's definitely stylish, and as small as it is, this is still a pretty solid device to play Game Boy games on. Yep, I stand corrected. Game Boy Advance games on. Those are the only games that work on here. It's a little bizarre because the DS was already only compatible with Game Boy Advance games. It didn't work with original Game Boy or Game Boy Color. So it just kind of makes me think like you could have made this like the ultimate Game Boy, and instead it just kind of ended up being like too expensive for what it's worth. Like it didn't have any functionality that the original DS didn't have. And this was only like $50 less expensive than the original DS. So like what were you gonna do? Were you gonna get this and just be able to play Game Boy Advance games when it was obvious that the Game Boy Advance was on its way out? Or you could have gotten a Nintendo DS, played all the Game Boy Advance games you want, and have access to a whole new slew of video games releasing constantly. And if you wanted original Game Boy and Game Boy Color support, you could still buy a Game Boy Advance SP. So the Game Boy Micro was definitely flashiness over function. It for sure functioned though. I mean, like, this is a damn good Game Boy Advance player. The Game Boy Micro is just a fashion statement. It's really cool, and I do like it, but there's no reason to play on this other than a Game Boy Advance SP unless you just want to look cute. I mean, it even comes down to like, yeah, you have interchangeable faceplates with this thing. I promise you. Look at that. Look at that. What did I say? Like, you make the Game Boy Micro look as you want it to that day. And just how small it is, the fact that it only plays Game Boy Advance games, you know, the coolest games, you know, not this garbage. It was obvious Nintendo was just trying to see if they could make the Game Boy last in a bit of a different way, you know, kind of make it more of like a cute little side thing for them, or rather than, you know, an obvious step forward. But the Game Boy Micro didn't do all too well. It sold like around 2 million units or so, which I think for what it was, you know, this is just kind of like a little extra thing they tried. You know, it didn't do all too bad, but it was obvious the Game Boy was not the future. The DS was Nintendo's future. And with that, the Game Boy line started to fade away. And it still remained relevant with the DS and DS Lite, but eventually the DS Lite got discontinued. And with that, the Game Boy line was nothing more than just a huge part of Nintendo's legacy. Which Game Boy is the best? Well, you know, that's the interesting thing, you know, the further we get down the line, the more they all kind of have pros and cons. You know, from the Game Boy Color and prior, you know, hey, none of those are the definitive Game Boy. I'm just gonna say that right now. The original Game Boy Advance definitely has the best feel, but of course, you know, it doesn't have a backlight. The Game Boy Advance SP has the most bang for your buck. It has everything you really need from a modern portable system. There's nothing really it skimps out on, other than no headphone jack. And the Game Boy Micro is just fucking cool. So what do you want? Do you want functionality? Do you want comfort? Or do you want coolness? I would honestly say the best Game Boy Advance would be a modded original GBA with a backlight. But if we're talking just official original hardware, the GBA SP AGS 101 is your go-to Game Boy. The Game Boy line is not only an integral piece of Nintendo's history, I feel like it's an integral part of everybody's culture at this point. Everybody knows what a Game Boy is. I remember my dad was giving like a speech somewhere and he was like, all these kids with their Game Boys and whatnot. I'm like, Dad, it's 2018. But that just goes to show how much of an impact the Game Boy left. And it's crazy to me that, yeah, it lasted that long, and then the brand just kind of just went away. They just went on to something new, and I think that's special. But I also think this brand has a lot left in it. I think Nintendo could revive the Game Boy branding whenever they want. They can name their next handheld the Game Boy 2 for all I care. Because respect your elders. Without the original Game Boy, we would have never gotten the new Nintendo 2DS LL Slime Edition. You can thank the Game Boy for this.